we're really lucky. We have Daphne R. McFerren, and she is the executive director of the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change at the University of Memphis. And prior to joining the Hooks Institute, she was in private practice in Washington, D.C. She was a senior counsel in the Office of General Counsel at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, was counsel to the late Attorney General Janet Reno, and was later Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Maryland, prosecuting, among other cases, forced labor and involuntary servitude cases involving foreign victims. And Ms. McFerren is also an award-winning documentary filmmaker and is the executive producer of a documentary on the life of the late civil rights activist Benjamin L. Hooks. She is currently in production on a film on civil and women's rights activist Ida B. Wells, who lived here in Memphis for a while, and she is a graduate of Yale College and Harvard Law School. So I'll turn things over to Daphne McFerren.
Lindley, thank you for having me today, and thanks to all of you for attending. I'm going to talk about civil rights in the context of art, culture, and photography. I think that would be very fitting in the context of the Dixon Gallery, while not losing the focus that my background and my parents' background is in civil rights history. I came to the University of Memphis practically by accident. In 2002, I began a documentary on my parents, who were leaders of the Fayette County, Tennessee movement. I grew up in Fayette County. And that movement started in 1959 when African Americans demanded the right to vote. We were in production and we needed to clear licenses, in addition, acquire additional financial resources to finish the film. And the University of Memphis allowed me to come here, finish up the film. The film was donated to the University of Memphis, and it's aired on WKNO for 5 years and on an intermittent basis thereafter. So we're now in production on a documentary on the life of Ida B. Wells. And I'm sure most of you know who she is. Ida B. Wells was a journalist who started a publication called The Free Speech. Her office was on Beale Street. And in 1892, her best friend, Thomas Moss, who started a grocery store that competed against a white business, was lynched, along with 2 people who worked in the store, primarily because they operated a business that was in competition with a white-owned business. Ida B. Wells protested that lynching and was driven out of Memphis. Actually, the paper was called the Appeal Avalanche, which, as you know, is now the Commercial Appeal. Was among one of the institutions that incited violence against her. She returned to Memphis. So she never returned to Memphis after she left in 1892. But Memphis, as it has done, has shaped some of the most significant leaders in civil rights in other areas. And so we're focusing on her. Now, what does that have to do with the Hooks Institute? Our mission is teaching, studying, and promoting civil rights and social change. We do that through scholarship, using the scholarship of faculty on campus to ameliorate disparities in the Memphis community. So an example of that is we are now working on issues pertaining to rent to own, or some people call them land installment contracts. And these are primarily people who want to own a home but don't qualify for traditional mortgages, and they will enter into these rental agreements, rent to own. But assuming the property, most of them have serious repairs to make to the property. And when they enter into these contracts, they are unaware they don't own the property. They are actually renting. They think they own it, but they don't. So when you're renting, you can't go to a mortgage company and get a mortgage to make these repairs because you're renting. So a lot of these properties end up either they lose them because they can't afford to make the repairs that code enforcement for the city of Memphis would like for them to make, or they are paying rates that are abnormally high compared to what you could get in the open market. So we will be training code enforcement in another month on how to look for these situations as they are enforcing Memphis city codes for housing in the city, and how to help people if they find out people are in these arrangements, what sort of legal referrals should they be making. I'd also like to point out, given the season, before I start with my PowerPoint, I don't think I have to tell this group that, you all look like a voting group. So I think I'm good with that. That this is, an important election. Every voice should be heard. And the Hooks Institute recent program was we call them policy papers. It's a publication that we do. And that publication was devoted entirely to voting and some of the issues of voting in Tennessee. So Tennessee, as you may or may not know, among the 50 states and the District of Columbia, Tennessee is 49th in the country in voter turnout. It is 45th in the country for voter registration. So you hear about all these restrictive laws coming out the Tennessee legislature, allegedly voting fraud. The laws are intended to address that, but they make it really, really difficult for people to vote. And here's a question I'll leave you with. If we're 49th in the state in voter turnout and 45th in voter registration, who are these laws intended to address? Because it seems to me nobody's voting and very few people are registering. So I've come to the conclusion that we're just paying a lot of free lunches up in Nashville, and that these are the kinds of facts that people need to know about. And I think the goal is to drive us to number 51 in the nation. And we're close approaching it, so we don't have far to go if you're 49. So in any event, I will then start with my presentation. So one of the things that Lindley knows is that I am the daughter of activists from Fayette County, Tennessee, and I'm going to share my screen and put it from the beginning. And so the title of this presentation is Art, Photography, and Social Justice Movements, because the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement, which scholars refer to as the modern civil rights movement, is clearly unlike previous movements because it's not the first time in American history people have struggled for the basic civil and human rights of African Americans. That's what the abolitionists fought for. The Reconstruction Amendments were intended to address that. But one fundamental difference is access to the media and the invention of technology. And that is the camera, and that is the film camera. And so here's a picture by Art Shea. Art Shea was a photographer out of Chicago. He photographed the rich and the famous, including Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, President John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, you named it, he photographed them. And in 1963, he went to Fayette County to capture this movement. Leading this movement are my parents, John and Viola McFerren. They're at the front, that's my mother and that's my father. The Fayette County movement started in 1959, as I said earlier, when African Americans demanded the right to vote.
Daphne, let me stop you for just a second, because all of us just see your desktop and we don't see the images.
You don't see the images?
No.
How is that? You shouldn't see my desktop. That's frightening. Okay. So you're seeing my Outlook?
I'm seeing, yeah, your desktop.
No, we're seeing 200 icons.
Okay, well, you should.
So
All
if
right.
you, I've done this before in a meeting, Daphne, and what happened was I didn't have my presentation fully open yet. So if you stop sharing and try to share again, it might help the situation.
Okay.
Sometimes it's just Zoom is tricky like that.
Thank you, Danielle.
No problem.
Okay, so now I'm trying to share the screen. It won't share at all. So that's lovely. So let me close out of it again. And if not, I'm just going to have to talk through this, which was not my plan.
I made sure that I just clicked multiple presenters. And so there it goes. We've got it now.
Okay. So yeah, that's what I had to do. I had to close out and then, so thank you. I want to go from beginning and lost my place. So in any event, I'm just gonna go through this. So can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So here are my parents. I've gone through that. This photograph was taken by Art Shea. The next photograph is my father in 1960 leading a voter registration drive in front of the Fayette County Courthouse. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with Fayette County. What was significant about the Fayette County movement is that when Black people started registering to vote, many of them in the late 1950s, 1960s were sharecroppers. And because my parents weren't sharecroppers, but because my father and other leaders went out and registered to vote, those African Americans who were sharecroppers were evicted from their property. And because of the image of photography, and this was taken by a AP reporter and given to one of the protesters at the time. So because of the importance of photography, the images, once they were evicted, Black people ended up living on 2 farms in Fayette County. And this is, and I have better pictures of this, but this is a farm, an image that showed up in the Chicago Daily News of African Americans living in tents, and that's where they went because they didn't own land for the most part in Fayette County. They were sharecroppers, which was a vestige of slavery. In Fayette County, and it's located close to Mississippi, that this part of the country very much mimics, and parts of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi, where Black labor had been used for centuries for crops, including tobacco and cotton. So this image in this photograph is one of the tents. And at one point, Tent City was first established. It was called Tent City because they were living in tents. And it was on the farm first, a man named Mr. Shepherd Tolles. He was a Black farmer who allowed families to erect their tents on his farm. And at its peak, Tent City had 100 children living there and numerous families. They were without running water, electricity, the ground, they were on the bare ground. And the winter, when the eviction started, began in December 1960. And they were afraid that these families would starve to death because they were families that traditionally had farmed. They were now without the resources that come with farming. And the movement took on a national profile as a result of the horrific images of people living in tents. So I'm not going to go through, this is some of the things that led up to this movement. And I tell people, and I'm just going to really digest it shortly because of the time limits we have here, that Fayette County, if you look at a continuum, obviously occurred after the Montgomery bus boycott. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was signed by Harry Truman, and the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Act of 1957 authorized the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, began to sue individuals as well as cities and municipalities for denying African Americans the right to vote. So in that context, Fayette County was related to activities that were happening both at the federal level and also activism throughout the country, including Montgomery, Alabama, and other places. One thing that distinguishes this movement from, let's say, the movement that is traditionally associated with Dr. King's leadership is that it was a rural grassroots movement, and scholars have noted that significance. Further, it was always led by local activists and not taken over or led by national civil rights activists at the time. So other images that appeared are these images, and I'm showing you these because these went national. These are people, African Americans, standing in front of the Fayette County Courthouse in 1960. And this voter registration effort went on for 2 or 3 years in an intense way. I mean, it went on through the 1960s until the early 1970s, but I would say one of the most intensive press periods was at the beginning registration efforts. And the images of people standing in line, fainting because of the heat for hours to register to vote resonated across the country. And the reason people stood in line for hours at a time is that the white registrar would close the office or only register 1 or 2 people at a time. What's also significant is the dress that you see in the photographs, and we're going to get to that in the film, is that people wore their very Sunday best to go register to vote because it was critical for them They never voted, actually, in any mass numbers since Reconstruction. And secondly, it was a way of demanding respect from whites as they confronted them in trying to exercise the basic civil rights of voting. Now, there's a lot of literature, and I've heard stories from people who were involved at the time. Obviously, I wasn't born when the movement started, but was born shortly thereafter, and was lucky enough to meet and know many of these brave and courageous people. And they will tell you, standing in this line, they would have people in the courthouse throw down on them coffee. They would spit on them. They would throw hot pepper on them, all for the right to vote. Now, one of my favorite photographs is this lady, because she has an attitude. And I just love her because she's like, I'm here to register to vote. And what are you going to do about it? I'm going to take you on. So I just kind of like the defiant attitude. I'm not sure that's how she felt, but I do like it. Here's another image of Blacks, African Americans, the line going up the stairwell to register to vote. And how these images resonated across the country are as follows. The United States, and especially President Kennedy, and one of his first press conferences was to address the denial of the right to vote in Fayette County. This image was being broadcast not only in the United States, but across the world. And after World War II, a lot of foreign countries and citizens were writing to elected officials in the US saying, how can the US conduct wars in other countries for the rights of others, but yet deny the rights of African Americans? And so that as well brought attention to Fayette County, Tennessee, and the basic denial of civil rights, the 14th Amendment to be treated as equal citizens, the 15th Amendment to vote in Fayette County. Had it not been for these images, I am not sure that it would have resonated as strongly as it did. So these were images of people setting up tents for families who had been evicted. This is a family moving into a tent. The first family to live in Tent City was Mary and Early B. Williams, pictured here. And while Mr. Williams was sleeping in his tent, a group of whites drove by Tent City and shot through Tent City and hit him in the arm. He was shot, but he was not injured in such a way that it decapacitated him long term. And they were interviewed for the documentary. It's called Freedom's Frontline, Fayette County, Tennessee. And they said they didn't understand at the time that you could lose your life trying to exercise a basic civil right just to vote. And I thought that was very powerful. Here are more images. Here's an image of New Jersey creating an image of my dad. He's speaking at this engagement in Lincoln Park, New Jersey. And these are flyers that they're handing out. And here's an aerial view of Tent City. Let's see if we can advance. All right, so at the first press conference that President Kennedy gave in January 1961, shortly after being sworn in, is that he was confronted by a reporter saying, after a discussion about nuclear missiles and Khrushchev and the Soviet crisis, what was he going to do about the deprivation of civil rights in Fayette County? That interview is on the archive site of the National Archives, and you can listen to President Kennedy's response. And basically, he says that he and his administration will not tolerate denial of basic civil rights, including voting of African Americans. And as many of you know, it took that fight continues today. In the 60s was entirely focused on that issue, African American right to vote. As you all probably are aware, the use of photography, the network's use of actual filming, including demonstration marches across the country, helped persuade the nation that this was an issue of civil rights and human rights that had to be addressed. Okay, more images of Tent City. And finally, I'm close to the end before I get to the video, because the video that the Hooks Institute created kind of summarizes and goes into more depth into the points that I'm making. Here are images of students from Cornell University who came down in 1963 to aid with voter registration and literacy. So one of the issues in Fayette County, among others, that is related to poverty was the issue of reading and writing, because obviously educating people of color was not a serious issue in Fayette County and other parts of the country, and frankly, in my view, is not taken seriously today. I tell people that my mother, Viola McFerren, who was the leader of this movement, moved from Benton County, Mississippi. And as you know, Benton County is adjacent to Tennessee. It's in the northern part of Mississippi. She moved to Fayette County to go to high school, because in Benton County, Mississippi, where she lived, there were no high schools for African Americans. So once she finished 8th grade, that was it. And so I say to students that I speak to and to groups that I am the first person on my maternal side of the family that didn't have to leave the state for a high school degree. So when we think about issues of class, racial disparities, economic disparities, health disparities, my story is not unique. There are lots of people of color who share my story or ended up migrating to other areas of the country. So if I am the first generation, I mean, some people go, I'm a first generation college student. You know, my mother managed to finish high school because frankly, my grandmother used the savings that her son sent to her, having served in World War II. She used those savings to pay for her daughters and one other son to go to high school. So that's essentially private tuition. So this is the history of many African Americans in our country. Okay, here's someone teaching a lady to read. And obviously the literacy was important for voting. And I don't know if you all can see this. I think the images may be blocking this, but you know, the 1960s, as we know, was one of the most transformative periods in American history. My mother served on the Anti-Poverty Committee, which was an advisory committee to the Office of the President. And here Hubert Humphrey is giving my mother a bracelet for service. It had his initials, HHH, for service on that committee. Some of the work of that committee led to the start of Head Start. And Head Start came to Fayette County as a result of my mother's service on that committee. And it was the first time Head Start had been in Fayette County. And I have to say, I'm a proud graduate of Head Start twice. The reason I went to Head Start twice is that I was too young. I'm a November baby. So I was too young to start first grade. And my best friend and cousin, who was my first cousin, Bridget, was also 5. And I had a hysterical fit that I couldn't go to Head Start with Bridget. So I ended up enrolling in Head Start with my first cousin, but still can go to first grade. So I had to repeat Head Start. So I have the privilege of being an Ivy League graduate and a twice repeater of Head Start. So next image. So when we talk about photographs of Fayette County, these are some of the things, and this is an image of Fayette County, but it's not unique to the violence that people experienced during the 1960s. And it's obvious from the photograph, here are protesters being corralled and subdued by the spraying of fire hoses on them. And this occurred in the town square of Fayette County. And this occurred around 1969 when demonstrators led by my father, mother, and other civil rights activists protested the beating of 3 Black women by 2 white men. And they said the beating represented, and how this happened, these women were driving and these 2 men almost ran them off the road. The Black woman who was driving in the car shouted out of her window to watch where they were going. They turned around, followed them home, and the 2 women and their mother, who was elderly, endured this brutal beating. So as a result of that, there was an economic boycott of Fayette County, and the New York Times actually covered the boycott. And they concluded that the Fayette County civil rights movement was one of the longest sustained civil rights protests in the nation. After other communities had turned their attention to pressing issues, including inflation and the Vietnam War, Fayette County activists were still focused on advancing basic civil rights guaranteed by a Civil War and changes to the US Constitution, which we call the Reconstruction Amendments. So as we look at these photographs, I am thinking about how will this moment in time 10, 20 years from now be reflected in photographs in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement. And an interesting story here is that we're in post-production on the Ida B. Wells film, but I had a photographer go to Washington to take pictures of the White House, especially the new gate around it, to keep protesters out and some of the signage. And she sent me back a photograph of a soldier, and this was 2 weeks ago, who asked her to take a picture of him with him taking a knee in front of the White House. And he said he wanted his photograph taken because he was so upset by the presidential debate in which the, what do they call, the bad boys or the poor, you know what I'm talking about, this white supremacist group, where President Trump failed to condemn white supremacy. And he felt that his service to the nation was somehow, it was a slap in the face to him to hear that. And we have this picture, and she took a picture of him from the back, kneeling in front of the White House in full camouflage uniform. And so I was made very much aware that these images will continue in this moment in time to reflect the struggle in this nation, and seemingly unending struggle, with reconciling its history and the present with seemingly to me, basic issues of humanity. So as we move forward through this moment, I think it's going to be interesting to see some of the signs. We took pictures of the signs that were on the White House gates of Black Lives Matter, the murder of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor, and on and on and on. There are also economic issues. And what I am interested in, and I don't have the answer to this yet, is what music will come out of this. So when you see the video that I'm going to show, and hopefully it'll play, you will see that the 1960s shaped not only the images that we saw coming out in fashion, it also shaped the music, and it also shaped the culture. It's inevitable. So the question is, as I am in this position, a historian and a chronicle of these contemporary events, what sort of artistic media comes out of this moment? And it'll be part of the Dixon and other galleries' responsibility to curate how we view this moment in time, because I know that it will shape this moment. I don't know how. So on to the next slide. Okay, so I'll skip that one. That's Faces of Fayette County. And hopefully the film will come up. So here's a film that the Hooks Institute did called The Civil Rights Movement, A Culture Revolution. Hooks Institute, that video, which is called A Civil Rights Movement, Culture Revolution, is on there, as well as other videos. And we created the video as a part of a fundraiser, actually, and then decided that we would go ahead and kind of share it as a product of the Hooks Institute. That video won the People's Choice Telly Award, as well as the Silver and Gold Telly Award. So we were surprised by that, but I think it's because of the content, and also because it resonates with so many people. So as we move forward and look at this moment, the question will be, what's going to come out of this moment in American history of divisiveness? And we have to remain hopeful that we advance the ball for civil and human rights, and that our culture is shaped positively in such a way that we are all beneficiaries. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Well, there are a couple of questions, and if anyone else has any questions, just go ahead and type them in. But I wanted to know if your grandparents were activists also, or if this is something that, that started with your parents and continued on with you.
Well, briefly, my grandparents on my mother's side, Rosetta, that's her name, I'm named after her, Rose, and my grandfather, Joseph Hubbard, were considered community leaders in Mississippi, where she grew up, primarily because they read. And they read the correspondence for community members. They wrote correspondence. They ordered from the catalogs, the Sears catalogs. They, were part of the groups that took care of other families and had the food, what we call food drives now, but they didn't call it that. They just called being a neighbor and taking care of people. I asked my mother, so that's on my mother's side. So I asked my mother, did her parents object to my father and her participating as leaders in leading a movement, because that movement made local and national news. When my aunt died, who was considered the historian of the family, I inherited my grandparents' trunks. And in those trunks were letters from my mother's brothers who were serving in the military, trying to persuade my mother and her sister, who was also involved, to not be engaged in the movement, because they said, you're going to get yourself killed. And I asked my mother, did her parents ever object or say anything? And she said during the whole time, and this movement had a national profile, she said she never heard either her father or her mother say a negative thing to her or try to dissuade my parents from their activism. And I said, do you mean they were completely silent? She said they never commented on it. So after they passed away, the flyer that I showed you with my father speaking in New Jersey, that came out of my grandfather's trunk. So he was actually keeping track of their activism in a silent way and supporting it by not saying anything discouraging, because among other things found in his trunk was an academic journal for moving back to Liberia as an African American. And he was really a scholar who was forced to farm. And my mother is pretty candid that he was one of the worst farmers that existed, because he really had no interest in farming. And that wasn't where his talents lie in terms of his talents. So my father's family, on the other hand, were always landowners shortly after the Civil War. Very independent, very leaders of that community before the movement. So I have this thing, I said, sometimes leaders spring from nothing, but I'm not necessarily convinced of that. I think leaders are sometimes generations in the making, whether or not they know it or not. And I see my parents as generations in the making, from the leadership that her parents provided, the fact that my grandfather's father was lynched, in Conway, Arkansas, because he was outspoken, which seems to be a problem family trait, that we're all outspoken. But so yes, there's a history of it if you trace it, and one that I think contributed to who they became in that moment.
I love that. Leaders are made generationally. And it's too bad that some people think it's not good to be outspoken, or it was deadly to be outspoken. That's really the crime. One thing I was curious about is the Black Panthers. I've never known a lot about the Black Panthers. I know that they have been portrayed in negative ways, that they only, were violent or caused trouble or whatever. But I've also heard that they did a lot to help the community, just basic good things, helping people get educations, even, maybe even providing food to people that needed it. So can you tell us a few things that the Black Panthers did that were really good for the community besides trying to just lift them up?
Well, they ran programs for children for food. They ran community banks. They ran literacy campaigns as well. And one of the things, we have to put this in context. And when I say context, I don't mean just the 60s. I mean from 1690 till today. And I don't think 1619 is the project that the New York Times did on the beginning of slavery until today. And so I don't think it's unreasonable for people, if you look at the totality of it, for groups to, after 400 years of enslavement and marginalization, to become radical. In fact, I think it's shocking that more people aren't radical, given what people experience. And that's why I point out I'm the first generation on my mother's side to not have to leave the state for a high school degree. Can't even imagine a white community being able to say that, not unless they're extremely poor. And I equate poverty on some level with issues of race. And that's a bridge, if bridged, would be very powerful. But there are a whole host of reasons I won't go into why that isn't bridged. And also, and I don't think we have to remember that America is some place that focuses on the center. And Dr. King was, I would call, he obviously was nonviolent. He also wanted to work through the system where he could. But he understood, as well as Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, it's those on the extreme left, the Black Panthers, the Malcolm X's, that bring America toward the middle, right? Because they're looking at, oh, wait a minute, we can't handle the extremeness, but we may not want to go where Dr. King is, but we'll meet in the middle. And I think that in American politics and American society, when you see movements, there are generally those extremes. And those extremes force America to a position that advances the ball a bit further. Had it not been for the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, we may not have seen some of the advances we saw in the 1960s, because the alternative was not acceptable to whites who were willing and saw the need to make societal, legal, and other accommodations. So I have no issues with the Black Panther and Malcolm X. For those reasons.
Well, thank you for also reminding us that the extremes bring us back to a reasonable place. That's a good thing to remember these days. And Mary wanted you to repeat, and Danielle actually put it down in the chat later on, repeat the name of the YouTube channel and the name of the file.
So it's called A Civil Rights Movement, A Cultural Revolution. And it's our our YouTube channel is called Ben L. Hooks Institute. So if you go to YouTube, you can subscribe. On that YouTube channel, you will also see videos by students who go through Memphis history. And most of the videos that students do are between 2 and 3 minutes. And so they go to places in Memphis that are not on the traditional radar for historical sites and go through Memphis history. You will also see videos of Hooks Institute programs. We have a program called the Hooks African American Male Initiative. It's a program here at the University of Memphis to increase the graduation rates of African American males here at the University of Memphis. Although African Americans are 65% of the city of Memphis, unfortunately that group constitutes one of the lowest graduating groups. They're improving, but we are not where we should be in terms of percentages. Ironically, African American women graduate at similar rates to white women. And the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, if you go to the Hooks Institute's website, which is memphis.edu/Ben Hooks, and you don't have to remember all this. You can just put in Benjamin L. Hooks Institute into Google search engine and it'll pull it up. The Federal Reserve economists wrote a paper for the Hooks Institute, and that presentation is on our YouTube channel as well. And one of the largest studies in US history was done by a professor who was at Harvard and now is at Stanford. And it showed that African-American boys, even if born into wealth, are likely to fall into poverty during their lifetimes. And the writers conclude, based on the data and looking at African-American women as a comparable group, the only common denominator for that huge discrepancy is racism. That it is racism which prevents and in fact reverses upward mobility for African-American men. So that's on our website. If you look at our policy papers, and also if you look on the YouTube channel for the policy papers presentation with the Federal Reserve Bank, the economist presenting that is also there.
Thank you. And I wanted to let you know that Julie Perotti, our curator, she was watching this and she said, "This was fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing this story." And Danielle Sumler, who is one of our Art to Grow instructors, has just subscribed. And I'm sure many of us will after this also. And Mary, Fortin, did I say your last name right? Says thank you. So that's the last question or comment I have in the chats. But if anybody wants to unmute for a minute and say thank you and say goodbye, you are more than welcome to before we sign off.
It was wonderful from Bill and Dana McKelvey. We really enjoyed it and found it very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.
And very informational. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I mean, thank you for your time. And I think what I would like to say leaving is that please be ambassadors for a more just and equal society. That these presentations, I'm very careful when I do these presentations because they're important to make, but I also don't want to be entertainment. That this is a very serious issue impacting the quality of lives of others. I am a beneficiary of the 1960s movement and those who fought and many who lost their lives, that, you know, I could even sit at this desk, right? So I recognize I have a huge responsibility to those who came before me and for those who come after. And I thank you all for supporting the Dixon. Also, and Lindley, I have to throw this in, you know, if you have other organizations you'd like to support, Hooks Institute accepts all dollars, it's green. You know, so, you know, you can, we do get some support by the University of Memphis. However, we also get a substantial portion of our support from donated and grant dollars, like all institutes, not only at the University of Memphis, but across the country. So thank you for your time. And thank you for your support of both Dixon, and please visit us at the Hooks Institute. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming back when you didn't have to. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Bye, thanks everybody.